So I have a pretty interesting history myself, but this isn't about me, so I'm not going to bore everybody with like a long, big dissertation about me. But I'm sort of tied to the recent history of New York interconnections. But I wanted to take us back a little bit through history, true history of New York network interconnections, so we have some perspective about where we are and where we're going. So, I'll hit that button. Okay. Just briefly, who can tell me what these two buildings are? What are these two buildings? Well, there are a lot of different things, but what are they? I think we know them, yeah. We're pretty familiar with those two buildings. Iconic Art Deco, built in the late 20s, brick, some clay duct in there. Okay, well, we could call them carrier hotels. Some people actually have referred to them as data centers, which I think is kind of funny. I've never seen anybody build a 1 million square foot brick building data center, but it just sort of happened there. The true answer, okay, to what these two buildings are, is that they're the first two email servers ever built, right there, downtown. And what's fascinating about it, because the two buildings were built to process messages in and out, and they were the two distinct, disparate networks, majority networks, in the country. Western Union was actually a roll-up play. It was an M&A strategy in the late 1800s to unionize all the telegraph networks west of the Hudson River. That's where it gets its name, Western Union. It was actually originally financed by some guys out of Boston, and they bought Mississippi Valley Telegraph and then New Orleans Telegraph and some others. And they had their own distinct copper network, heavy gauge copper. And all those copper lines ran back to 60 Hudson. And then, of course, AT&T is American Telephone and Telegraph, still is today. A lot of people don't know that second T is Telegraph. And they had a similar thing under the Bell patent for copper, heavy gauge copper lines in a completely different, disparate footprint in the United States. And if you wanted to send a telegram from a Western Union office to an AT&T office from one part of the country to another, and it was pure incumbency, they didn't have overlap in their footprints back then because it was just wide open. The message would originate, let's say, for example, in New Orleans on Western Union, and it was bound for Chicago on AT&T, it would get routed through New York. And it wouldn't just get routed electronically like we would all think. It actually got reduced to paper and got put into a canister and sent through a pneumatic tube from one building down to the basement and then up 7 blocks or down 7 blocks, depending on the direction, to the other building, and then routed within the building to a room on a floor that was the representation of that network head end that represented that part of the country. And that's how telegrams moved around the United States, which are basically paper versions of email in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Of course, these buildings were built by the same guy, Ralph Walker, who worked for Voorhees Walker, which is an architectural engineering firm out of Newark, New Jersey. And he designed these two buildings. And another interesting thing about the history of this is that every Bell Central office downtown in the center of town is brick because of these two buildings. This is the alpha and the beta. Every brick CO is brick because of these two. And the reason why they're brick is because the original Western Union building, which was about 10 blocks south, was made of wood, and it was painted with this fireproof polyurethane. And it burned to the ground in about 3 seconds. And all communications in North America and the US were knocked out for many, many months before it could get rebuilt. So the idea was to, quote unquote, not get burned again. Sorry, the bad pun. So they decided to build a brick building. And that's where these two things came from. So let's get into the root of what email actually looked like back in these days in the early 1900s. These are actually pictures I found in the archives, okay, for telegraph pneumatic tubes between 60 Hudson and 32 Avenue of the Americas. This is what the basement used to look like. Anybody that's done work down there like Ray, I know Ray's done it. Trihari knows what this looks like too. There's all these conduit systems, and they're actually sending and receiving canisters with paper messages. And this is what the original Newby room looked like. It would be called the Tube Center. And they were in the basement of those two buildings. And that's how they routed messages back and forth. You can see here This is how email was delivered, which is kind of interesting, electronic, actual physical mail, being inserted in these different torpedo tubes and sent back and forth. Very efficient system. So that's what cross connects looked like in the early 1900s. Fascinating, right? She's a tech, and she's running cross connects. She's jumpers. She's taking a canister from here and putting it over there and routing messages. If you think about all the protocols that we have today for routing messages, right, SMTP or whatever, that's what it looked like in a binary sense back in the day. So this is actually a telephone cross-connect. I had a telegraph cross-connect picture, and I want to explain the distinction between the two. But I couldn't put it up here because the resolution wasn't good enough. But the telegraph cross-connect, the switch, and there's actually murals of this on the walls in the lobby of 60 Hudson Street. If anybody's ever interested, go on and check it out. It's like, it should be in the Smithsonian. But before the electric switch was created, they routed, manually. Then they created a switch that actually took two copper lines and they like twisted pair that connected it together. And then they created something in around about 1940 that looked like an early predecessor to a DAX, if you know what a DAX is. I know Harold knows what a DAX is. We did a lot of work with DAXs back in the day. So those were wires that were actually connected to each other on boards in a really big box, giant box. But you see what they're doing as switchboard operators. This is a telephone. Different technology, different patents, and really ultimately how Bell beat out Western Union because they extended phones into homes, which created the last mile problem, but it solved the proximity issue going to telegraph stations. But you could look at these operators and what's different about them than a telegraph switch operator. And it's pretty clear it's the headset. The jumpers used to be run for telegraphs, but it was all zeros and ones basically. So there's nothing to listen to when you patched it in. The original telegraph operator had to listen and then transcribe. You didn't have to do that anymore. The telephone operators, they're actually listening to people speak to them and patching the wires together to set up calls. But they were the original version of the NSA. And you would actually just sit there and listen to people's phone calls.
That's right.
Okay, so Western Union Building, my favorite place. I learned a lot from this building. It doesn't talk, but it taught me a lot. So what you saw in the preceding slides was a copper version of early days, pneumatic tube version of telegraph. Just before that, it was smoke signals. I didn't have any pictures of those though. Then you had pneumatic tubes, then you had wiring, actual manual switching, and then all of that in this building eventually evolved into this. This is a picture of the original Telex meet me area on the west side, and you can see our techs back in the day, my old techs at Telex, were wiring things, and there's a whole lot going on in this picture. This is back when we actually let active elements into the meet me area. You can see there's a MUX there, the bottom left. That was actually Global Crossings, Cisco 454. And there's a mix of DSX1, DS3s, and fiber. So this picture actually shows a little bit of transition from the legacy copper subrate breakouts, transitioning into fiber. But the point is, change is the only constant. Keep that in mind. Change is the only constant. Everything's always changing, but the thing that remains the same is the need to communicate. And if there's one thing that's a theme throughout this whole thing is the need to communicate. It goes back to smoke signals, sounds, pneumatic tubes, copper wires, transitioning to fiber. But here we have technicians running jumpers. That's no different than what they were doing back in the day, connecting phone lines or telegraph lines or even handing off pneumatic tube cylinders. It's the same, but it's different, okay? There's another shot. This is actually from the 23rd floor Telex facility way back when. And you can see in the far back on the left, T1s, then DS3s, and then fiber. I mean, that's literally like the rings of a tree right there in that one shot. Today, nobody's installing DS3s or DS1s. Nobody. It's all gone. I don't even see anybody installing Cat5.6. It's all fiber. So there's been a big transition even in the last 15 years to optics in the core. And then the final shot here is the meet me area on the east side. I mean, I had another picture here where this showed the racks were empty and now they're all full, and I think everybody gets the point, but a lot of times when we walk into facilities like this, nobody knows where it all came from. They just think that it's always been there, and that's not the case. Those pictures I just showed you were all empty rooms, and now, there's something like 50,000 cross connects just there on the 9th floor at 60 Hudson Street. Of course, all that, has now become this Digital Realty. And Digital Realty on the building side, right, so ownership of the buildings themselves, which is something that I understand and appreciate. That was a deal that Telex did with Digital many years ago to acquire their Meet Me rooms, and now Digital has acquired fully Telex and integrated it. And I think that's a very important point. When you think about communications going back to Western Union, they owned the entire building, the pneumatic tubes, the copper lines, and the entire network. They had their own distinct infrastructure separate and apart from AT&T, and there needed to be a way to connect those two things. So it's funny, that was all sort of broken apart, technologically speaking, and it all has come back together again. And we see this oscillation happen over decades. Again, change is the only constant. There's another layer of this, though, beyond the physical layer, buildings, and the physical layer, fiber presence and interconnections. So there's a new kid on the block here in New York that sort of has an idea about how this all works in terms of ownership of the building and the Meet Me room combined, and with a heavy focus on just physical layer interconnections. That company is called Netrality, and this is the Netrality Properties building here, 325 Hudson Street in New York, which happens to be one of the locations where DKIX has a presence. So I'd like to thank Harold, if you're listening, and Ivo and Ed and the whole DKIX crew for being a part of that exciting movement there. This is new. When you say new Carrier Hotel, it was a building that was acquired in April 2012 by a partnership with myself and the Miramar Properties, and then our equity partner Jamestown, who happens to be actually based out of Germany. And Josh Mays is here somewhere today. Josh is in the back. He's with the Miramar. So we resurrected my old Telex Meet Me Room model and inserted it here with common building and Meet Me Room ownership. So I just threw up the Axiom fiber map as one of the fiber providers in the city. There are many out there, but it's the one that I had readily available. Just the point that I wanted to highlight here in terms of the history of connectivity in New York City is that there's some pretty well-known addresses there. A couple of the new ones, 375 Pearl Savvy, it's got Dan's in the room. That's a new building, essentially, but that was a former Verizon building, same kind of concept. And then, of course, 325 Hudson Street added to 60 and 32, which were the first two that I showed you the buildings of, which we all know. And, of course, 111 8th Avenue, which Google now owns. But from a passive fiber connectivity standpoint, you're looking at the best buildings in town. And certainly 325 Hudson Street in the last 24 months, we've brought in over 12,000 strands from every franchise holder in the city. So thank you, Cliff and Ray and Trihari and everybody in the room for being a part of that. So I'd be remiss in not mentioning this because DKIX does have a presence in New Jersey. And if we're talking about the history of connectivity and the evolution of connectivity in the region, we need to pay attention to New Jersey because things have changed. And I just got this map from a friend of mine, and it just gives a very high level of how many data centers there are. 165 Halsey Street is notably absent from this, which is because the guy I got it from is a real estate guy that focuses on data centers. But you have to add Halsey Street out of respect. But none of this existed. There weren't any of these facilities 15 years ago. Nobody even thought about going to New Jersey. And now there are more facilities and more square feet and more megawatts in New Jersey than there are in Manhattan. I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but it has a lot to do with migration, tying back into what Ed talked about earlier about the round trip to Ashburn. The carrier hotels in the city aren't necessarily where the servers go. They're not supposed to. It's too expensive. The buildings weren't built for it. The servers go to data centers, and data centers always hive around meet points, always. They're always satellites to meet points. And in their own right, over time, they acquire their own physical layer fiber routes in and out, and they become sort of interconnection points. But the owners of those data center properties aren't focused on the interconnection business. The interconnection business is very unique. It's for carrier hotels primarily, and the people that own those and understand how those work. So I just wanted to put this up here because it's important to note that the whole region has expanded dramatically. This is a list of all those sites, and I didn't want to sit here and just add it all up, but the number of square feet is staggering. And that's just this New Jersey market. And it's an outgrowth of those first two big brick buildings that I showed you. in the less than 80 years. Pretty impressive, pretty amazing stuff. And of course, D-Kicks has a presence. Now, to touch on D-Kicks and a little nod to Ed here, and what a great job Ed has done in the region, in the New York, New Jersey region. This is just an IX growth chart and how many new members that D-Kicks has added, not an aggregate total, but we had asked for the slide, and Ed, thank you for getting that over. I'll make note of one thing on this, putting aside some of the quote-unquote competition, but the Big Apple Peering Exchange is actually something I helped Shrihari put together back in the Telex days. That's 14 years ago now. We had a notion of the need for an internet exchange, but I want to touch on what Ed was asked by Harold, which is how have you been successful here? Is that you're independent, but that you have a focus on peering. That's what you do. You come from Frankfurt, you perfected it there, you have all the major network operators as peers, as members, and trusted partners. And you bring the concept here, and it takes time, but you execute. And the independence is the focus on being an IX, but not also having to own the building or own the space and run the colo part of it to then do the IX part of it. And I think the European models worked out really well as a result. I've always seen that it was better. It attracted a lot of tenants to the landlord, so the landlord did well to have a really good IX or a node like that. If they tried to do it on their own, they usually didn't do the best job. So hats off to you, Ed, for getting those numbers where they are and helping New York solve its problem. And then I just wanted to put that last slide up there real quick. This is the evolution of peering and the evolution of network interconnection in New York and New Jersey. And these are the D-Kicks locations. I'm super happy to have one of them, 325 Hudson on the list, so thanks again for that. But notice how many are in New Jersey as the burgeoning growing market here. So again, thank you for your time. This is just a brief history on connectivity in the region. Thank you. I don't know if we have questions time, but yeah, I could field a couple questions if anybody had any. I'm sure that this room's full of very, it's like super, well, Sophie's here now. She's got a couple questions. All right. Well, thank you again. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.